Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Lord Montgomery. Chapter 2. A Sad Story. When Anne woke up the next morning, she felt happy. She jumped out of bed and ran to the window. It was a beautiful morning. The sun shone and the sky was blue. Anne opened the window. Outside there was a fruit tree with beautiful flowers. Anne could see many other trees and flowers, and a small river too. "This is a wonderful place," she thought. Then suddenly she remembered. She felt very sad again. "But I can't stay here," she thought. "They don't want me because I'm not a boy." Marilla came into the room. "Good morning, Anne," she said. "Breakfast is waiting. Wash your hands and put on your clothes." "I'm feeling very hungry," Anne said. "I can never be sad in the mornings. I love mornings." After breakfast, Anne washed the plates and cups. Marilla watched carefully, but Anne did the job well. "This afternoon I'm going to drive to White Sands," Marilla said. "You'll come with me, and we'll talk to Mrs. Spencer, Anne." Matthew didn't say anything, but he looked very sad. Later he got the horse and buggy ready for Marilla. Marilla drove, and Anne sat next to her. "Is it a long way to White Sands?" asked Anne. "About 8 kilometers," answered Marilla. "I know you like to talk, Anne, so tell me your story." "It isn't very interesting," said Anne. "I was born in Bolingbroke in Nova Scotia, and I was 11 last March. My parents were teachers, but they died when I was a baby. So their cleaner, Mrs. Thomas, and her husband took me into their house to live. Mrs. Thomas had 4 children. I helped her take care of them. But then Mr. Thomas died in an accident. Mrs. Thomas and the children went to live with Mr. Thomas's parents, so they didn't want me. Then Mrs. Hammond, Mrs. Thomas's friend, took me into her house to live. She had 8 children. They were very hard work. Then Mrs. Hammond moved away. I had to go to the orphanage because nobody wanted me. I lived at the orphanage for 4 months. "Did you go to school?" asked Marilla. "No, not often," answered Anne. "I didn't have time. I was always busy with the children. But I like reading very much." "Were these women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, kind to you?" asked Marilla. "Well, they wanted to be kind," Anne said slowly, "but they were always very tired. They couldn't really be kind to me." Marilla suddenly felt very sorry for Anne. The little girl's life was very sad. Nobody wanted her or loved her. When Mrs. Spencer saw Marilla and Anne arrive, she was very surprised. Marilla took hold of her and told her about the problem. "I'm very sorry," answered Mrs. Spencer. "I made a mistake. But I have an idea. My neighbor, Mrs. Blewett, has a new baby. She wants a girl to help her. Anne can go and live with her." "Oh," said Marilla. She knew about Mrs. Blewett. Mrs. Blewett had a lot of children, but she wasn't very kind to them. "Look," said Mrs. Spencer. "Here's Mrs. Blewett now." Mrs. Blewett had small, cold eyes. "This is Marilla Cuthbert from Green Gables," Mrs. Spencer told her. "And this little girl is from the orphanage. I brought her for Marilla. but Marilia wants a boy. Would you like her?" Mrs. Blewett looked at Anne for a long time. She didn't smile. "She's very thin," she said. "I hope she's strong. She'll have to work very hard." "Yes, Mrs. Spencer, I'll take this girl. She can come home with me now." Marilia looked at Anne's unhappy face. "I can't give Anne to Mrs. Blewett," she thought. "Wait," she said. "First I have to discuss things with my brother, Matthew. He wants Anne to stay with us." Anne looked at Marilia in surprise. Then she jumped up and ran across the room. "Can I really stay with you at Green Gables?" she asked. "Did you really say that?" I don't know," said Marilia. "Now sit down and be quiet." When Marilia and Anne arrived at Green Gables, Matthew met them. He was very happy when he saw Anne again. Later, Marilia told him about Mrs. Blewett. She told him Anne's story, too. Matthew wasn't usually angry, but he was very angry about Mrs. Blewett. "That Blewett woman is very unkind," he said. "I know," said Marilia. "I don't like her at all." "All right, Matthew, Anne can stay here with us. But I don't know very much about children. I hope I don't make any mistakes with her." "Thank you, Marilia," said Matthew happily. "Anne's a very interesting little girl. Let's be good to her. Then she will always love you." The next day, Marilia didn't tell Anne about her conversation with Matthew. She gave Anne a lot of work in the kitchen. "Marilia," said Anne excitedly, "I have to know about my future. Please tell me, are you going to send me away?" "No," said Marilia. "You can stay at Green Gables with Matthew and me. But you have to promise to be good." Anne started to cry. "Why are you crying?" asked Marilia in surprise. "Don't you want to stay with us? Don't you like Green Gables?" "Oh, yes," cried Anne. "I like it very much. I'm crying because I'm happy, and I'll always be good." Some days later, Mrs. Lynde came to tea with Marilia. When she arrived, Anne was outside. Marilia and Mrs. Lynde sat in the kitchen and talked. "I think you're making a mistake," said Mrs. Lynde. "You don't know anything about children." "No, but I can learn," said Marilia. Anne ran into the kitchen. She saw Mrs. Lynde and stopped. "The Cuthberts didn't take you for your pretty face," Mrs. Lynde said. "She's very thin, Marilia, and her hair is as red as carrots. Come here, child, I want to see you." Anne ran across the kitchen and stood in front of Mrs. Lynde. Her face was red and angry. "I hate you," she cried. "I hate you. I hate you." "Anne," cried Marilia. "You're a very rude woman," Anne told Mrs. Lynde. "And you're fat." "Anne, go to your room," said Marilia. "Wait for me there." Anne started to cry. Then she ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde got up from her chair. "I'm going home now, Marilia," she said. "That child is very wild. You'll have a lot of problems with her." "But you said unkind things about her," said Marilia. After Mrs. Lynde went home, Marilia went upstairs. Why did Anne say those things, she thought unhappily. Now Mrs. Lynde will tell everybody in Avonlea about her. Marilia remembered something. When she was a child, her aunts often talked about her. "Marilia isn't a very pretty little girl," they said. "Maybe Mrs. Lynde was unkind," said Marilia quietly. "But Anne, you have to say sorry. Stay here in your room." End of Chapter 2.